Hey there, everyone. Thanks for joining up. It's exactly 9 p.m. on the East Coast. So we're going to wait another minute and then we'll officially begin. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. Before we begin tonight's broadcast, I just want to say a few pieces of business. First of all, my producer is out of town this week for the Sukkot holiday, so this is going to be a very pared down version of the podcast. If you're listening on Apple or on Spotify, no music, no transitions, or any of that jazzy stuff. Just me talking to you because she is away, but still really good content, so stick around. The second thing is, I want to thank everyone who has contributed to the 2024 fall fundraising campaign on behalf of Inside Israel. The podcast is free and it's ad free, no paywalls, and I definitely want to keep it that way. So many of you have already stepped up to the plate. My goal was $10,000, which is just under what it takes to produce this for a year, and we're approaching the $7,500 mark. If you look on the actual GoFundMe page, it's less than that because some people are sending contributions through PayPal and Venmo. If you still want to give, the fundraiser is going to continue through Sukkot, so through the high holidays. And I'm going to put the link in the chat right now. If you're listening, it would be joelchasanoff.com/podcast. And thanks for your support. And now we will begin. Welcome to tonight's episode of Inside Israel. Again, it's the week of October 13th, 2024. And tonight's episode is called Observations, Yom Kippur 5785. And my intention for tonight was really just to share a few of my own observations from what Yom Kippur was like in Israel this past weekend. I do want to make a quick diversion. There is somewhat of a big news story playing out in Israel as we speak. By the time you listen to this on Wednesday, on one of those platforms, it might already seem woefully out of date the way the news changes here. But at the moment, I'm recording this Sunday night. This is a big news story unfolding. I'm not sure if it's even made it to the US, but what's called I guess in English, a UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle. And in Hebrew, we call it katbamim, which is klei tais bilti metuyas, an unpiloted aerial vehicle. In any case, a UAV crashed into Israel, hit what we believe was its target. What we know now is that two of these were fired from Lebanon. They were tracked on Israeli radar, and one of them was shot down. The other one disappeared off of radar, and so it was assumed that it had just fallen into the sea. But unfortunately, what happened, it seems, is that it was flying so low and close to the ground that it was actually untraceable by radar. And for a long time, I mean, relative, for a few hours, for the first few hours of this story, it was said in the news that this hit somewhere in the town, near the town of Binyamina. Binyamina is an area in just where the Galilee begins, the lower Galilee in Israel. But Dorit, my wife, who you know is very involved with the IDF and has contact with a lot of commanders and officers, she knew immediately that this was actually an attack on the IDF. And right now, that is the news coming out of Israel. This UAV struck what's known in Hebrew as Bach Golani. Bach is it's an abbreviation, Roshei Tevot, for Basis Hadracha, meaning training base. This is basically the basic training base for the Golani Brigade. Golani is one of the most storied infantry brigades in the IDF. And this UAV struck the dining hall around dinner time, injuring over 70 soldiers. Right now, the number I've heard is that four soldiers have been killed. And to understand who these soldiers were, I don't know exactly, but most likely they were basic trainees or soldiers in their very early stages of training. These are the soldiers who go to Bach Golani, the Golani infantry instruction base. So it's likely that they were very young in their service. And so I just wanted to bring that piece of news to you. This is a huge story in Israel. Sadly, we've gotten very used to hearing about soldiers killed in Lebanon, more so in Gaza. But now to hear that Hezbollah was able to reach one of our military bases, which is actually quite far from the border between Israel and Lebanon. It's much closer to central Israel than their other targets. It's deeply depressing. It's confounding. It's upsetting because, like I said, this was tracked on radar at the beginning, and then it fell off radar. So a lot of a lot of upset in Israel right now. Of course, it's the middle of the night, so this will be a continuing story tomorrow. Um, but when I talked to Dorit and some other people, their reaction was, Ad Matai, how long is this going to keep going on in all these different forms? So I did want to bring you up to date on that story that's unfolding right now in Israel, really, as I speak to you. As for the show itself, again, the title is Yom Kippur, an overview for 5785. And just to give you a little background, Yom Kippur is one of my favorite days on the calendar in Israel. And this is ironic because as a kid, probably like a lot of you, although I won't put words in your own mouths, but as a kid, I could not stand Yom Kippur. I hated Yom Kippur. Of course, it was a fast day. Even when I was too young to fast, I had to go to synagogue all day and sit in synagogue with 2,000 people, the walls opened and extra chairs set up, and listen to all these prayers and pew team I was not familiar with. So boring. And if you'd asked me, would I look forward to Yom Kippur ever? I would have said no. Of course, who looks forward to Yom Kippur? But in Israel, Yom Kippur is one of my favorite days on the calendar. And I'm not alone in that. Many Israeli kids also say that Yom Kippur is one of their favorite days of the year. And the reason, if you've been to Israel on Yom Kippur, you know why. But if you haven't, then I'll tell you. The reason is that on Yom Kippur, it's pretty much a biking holiday for children. Nobody drives in Israel on Yom Kippur. And this isn't by law. It's really amazing. It's just a collective agreement amongst everyone in the country that you do not drive your car on Yom Kippur. For my recent book, Israel 201, I researched, there's a chapter on Yom Kippur bike rides. And I researched why is this? When did it start? And I got so many answers. And at the end of the day, nobody knows when this tradition started, why it started. But for as long as anyone I could talk to remembered, nobody drives their car in Israel on Yom Kippur. And so what do kids do? They go on these long bike trips. And to be clear, it's a lot of adults as well. Adult enthusiastic bike riders. This is the one day of the year that they can safely ride their bike anywhere they want. You'll have rides from Haifa to Tel Aviv or Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. On the highways, they're completely empty. Streets are filled with bikers. So to me, it's not just a special day because I get to see something I never saw in the US. To me, it really is the epitome of the next level of Judaism. This is what happens when you have a Jewish country of your own. Yom Kippur no longer has to be a day of dreariness and fasting, and for many it is, but it can be commemorated in another way. In the United States, if on Yom Kippur, if you're Jewish and you don't go to synagogue, it's almost as if you're not Jewish at all. And I'm not trying to judge any of you if you didn't go, but to me, it would be absurd not to go to synagogue on Yom Kippur. It's how you know you're Jewish. It's how you're part of the community. But in Israel, you don't need to go to synagogue or even fast on Yom Kippur to know that you're part of something different and special. If you're just looking outside and seeing all the bikes or riding a bike yourself, you are part of the next iteration of Jewish expression and Judaism. And so to me, it's a very special day on the calendar. So that's some background, and I wanted to give you now some insight into what this year's Yom Kippur was like because it was different in a few ways. And again, this is all anecdotal. This is me telling you what I observed. Everyone would have their own take. But this is certainly what I saw on this Yom Kippur. Well, I should add one more thing. In addition to all the bikes, Yom Kippur is also a big day to hang out with friends, especially Erev Yom Kippur on the night after Kol Nidre. It's sort of a tradition. There in Ra'anana, where I live, there might be 30 synagogues, and after Kol Nidre is finished, around 8:30, 9 o'clock, everyone comes out of their various synagogues and just hangs out in the public square. The streets are flooded with people. And when I say flooded, it's like standing in line to get into a stadium before the game begins. One small step and then another small step. Just a mass of people walking down the street. If you look around, all you see are heads. The streets are packed with people. So it's adults too. It makes Yom Kippur kind of fun because after, you're fasting, but you're also able to hang out with friends. Again, it's what happens when Jews have a country of their own. So, what did I notice this year? First of all, there were far fewer people out on the streets. I would say about my estimation, about a third as many of the usual people. So two-thirds of the people were not there. And I think the reason was a lot of people, including myself, were really suspicious of an attack happening. With all the bombings, and Hezbollah continuing to shell us and Hamas attempting to shoot missiles when they can, we sort of expected that if anyone was going to try something, Yom Kippur would definitely be the date because of the Yom Kippur War, because October 7th was the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, because Yom Kippur is the holiest day on the calendar, and our enemies know that it's our soft spot. And what better way to hurt us than to fire missiles on Yom Kippur? So for this reason, there was much less turnout of adults and also fewer bikes. Usually it's kind of a dangerous affair trying to walk in the streets because of all the bikes zigging and zagging going this way and that. It really didn't feel like that this year. There were fewer bikes out on the streets. There was also fear that one way a terrorist attack could happen. Um, this came into my head. Other people thought about it was if, God forbid, an Arab citizen of Israel simply got in their car and drove on the highway or into any town on the streets. Um, that would be a very easy way to carry out a terrorist attack because with all the kids out on bikes and adults walking in streets, we would be easy targets. And I think the army picked up on this as well because the army set up, in Hebrew, it's called machsomim, like roadblocks along the highways to make sure that cars would not be allowed to enter towns. So if anyone did get in their car. So this was on a lot of people's minds as well. Another point or difference that I noticed was despite the fact that it's a fast day, Yom Kippur is kind of a joyous day for a lot of Israelis because of what I said before, because you're hanging out with friends, because the entire country pretty much dresses in white. There's this real communal experience of us going through something together. And this year, that joy just didn't seem to be there. Keep in mind, we were only 3 days out from the anniversary of October 7th, the 1 year anniversary. And the 1 year anniversary, it wasn't even a year to look back on something that had happened a year ago. It's something that we're still going through now. We still have soldiers now fighting on two fronts in two foreign pieces of territory. The hostages are still in Gaza. So the sense that this would be a day of escape or celebration or it didn't have that feel because this is still the moment we're living in is still very heavy for all of us. Instead, what I felt was a certain amount, let's say, a certain amount of cynicism. Like, what am I even praying for? What am I even fasting for? If the hostages are still there and there really seems to be less and less hope that they would come out, what is all this for? Who is actually listening? And so there was there was some cynicism in the air and on people's lips in conversation that you usually don't see on Yom Kippur. And as predicted, at one point during the post Kol Nidre time, when everyone was hanging out on the streets, there was an air raid siren that we heard in Ra'anana. Now it went off in Herzliya, but because there was no traffic and no planes, no commercial planes, we were able to hear the siren in Herzliya, and it sent a wave of panic. Everyone began running, a mass exodus from the streets as everyone ran toward their homes or apartment buildings. I saw a number of teenagers. There's one pack of teenage girls, maybe ninth, 10th grade, who really started freaking out, and we sort of calmed them down and told them, "Don't worry." But they were out in public, didn't know where the nearest bomb shelter was. So yeah, there was an air raid siren. It turned out a Beit Avot, how do you say in English properly? Old age home, a place for older people. I forget the English word for it. Was actually hit by a one of these. I think it was one of these UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. No one injured, but the building nevertheless damaged. And another thing you saw in the days leading up to Yom Kippur were especially near these communal places. There's two really big communal places in Ra'anana. There's Yad Labanim, which is sort of like the town square, and then there's Park Ra'anana, the big park. Those are where a lot of people hang out. And a very Israeli thing is that how people with homes near there uh, put put signs on their gates on their fences saying bomb shelter inside with an arrow so that if anyone was in the area and needed a bomb shelter, they knew they could go into this person's home and use their bomb shelter. I don't think there's a more Israeli act than that. That's certainly up there in terms of the a symbol of who Israelis are. And the last observation I have, and this was noticeable by everyone, was how many fighter jets we heard over the Yom Kippur holiday. I mean, really loud Israeli fighter jets flying overhead. And I have two theories about this. First of all, the targeted bombings in Beirut and other parts of Lebanon and Gaza, those continued over Yom Kippur. There's no break for the military when you're at war. But I think they were happening for another reason as well. And maybe this is just wishful thinking on my part, but I believe that one of the reasons we heard so many fighter jets was the Army's way of reassuring us that, hey, we're still here. We haven't forgotten about you. We're taking care of things so you can do your Yom Kippur business as planned. It was just sort of a reminder to us that our military is there because, on October 7th, so many of us felt abandoned. Um, I do feel that this is one of the Army's ways of reassuring us that we could go about, despite our fears of an attack on Yom Kippur, that we could go about Yom Kippur and that the Army would be there. So those were my observations on how Yom Kippur was different this year. It certainly was. God willing, we were all praying special different prayers in our B'nai Knesset, in our various synagogues. And I went to synagogue for a little bit. There's a new sort of conservative synagogue in Ra'anana that I really like. And I finally feel like I found a home in a synagogue there. but we said a number of prayers on behalf of the hostages. And Yom Kippur, no holiday will ever be the same until the hostages are out. So that's first and foremost on our minds. I'm going to take a quick break and then come back to answer your questions that you sent in. See you in a second. Okay, we had a few questions come in this week, but I'm going to address two of them because they're both kind of long. The first question, and I don't happen to have the names of those who sent them in front of me, but thank you for sending them in. The first one was, who actually comes up with the plans for Hamas and Hezbollah? Is it them, or do the Iranians make all the plans for the proxies? And I think we're actually learning what the answer to this question is. One of the big stories coming out of our part of the world recently is that Hamas actually carried out their October 7th attack, quote unquote, early. That the plan was to wait for coordination with Hezbollah so that Hezbollah could attack from the north, the same kind of attack as Gaza, as happened from Gaza, penetrating the fence, kidnappings, hostage taking, mass murder. Uh, this was supposed to be coordinated between the two, but Sinwar, who leads Hamas in Gaza, did not have patience and so just acted on his own, thinking that Iran and Hezbollah and Syria and ISIS would join. So what it seems is that Iran, although these are proxies of Iran, that it does seem they work a bit independently. So that is what we're learning. And in this sense, it could be that October 7th, what happened in a way was able to save us from a much larger and more devastating tragedy, which is so strange to say. But given the fact that there was not coordination, many in Israel believe that unbelievable we would use the word lucky associated with October 7th, but that we were lucky, that it could have been much worse. And what it actually did is signal us to the danger around us. And now, we're really we're doing our best to destroy Hezbollah and their capability on the northern border, discovering the amounts of weapon. I don't know if you're following how much we're discovering in these villages, these Shia villages along the border with Israel, but every house is pretty much a storage room for rockets and combat vests and helmets and RPGs and anti-tank missiles and Kalashnikov rifles. The idea was that the Radwan elite Hezbollah unit would show up, suit up, get their equipment, and invade Israel. And now because of October 7th, we are able to destroy this capability. And I talked to some people with really deep knowledge of what's happening in Lebanon right now. And they told me the soldiers, IDF soldiers, are literally going house to house. There is no way to just carpet bomb. It is house to house in these villages in southern Lebanon, from the Mediterranean all the way to the border with Syria. And every house they are finding these kind of storage of weaponry and equipment that would be used to attack Israel. There's no other way to do it except to go house to house. So to answer the question, it does seem like there's supposed to be coordination from among the three, but that they do act independently. The second question I want to address, it was a very long question from someone who'd written in saying that her daughter met and fell in love with an Israeli and is now living in Israel and debating whether to come back to, I believe it was St. Louis, or to keep on living there. And this mother is saying, I want my daughter to come to the US so they can be close, but at the same time, I understand that she might want to be in Israel. What what light can I shed on this question as someone who kind of went through this dilemma myself? And I do relate to this as someone who's married to a Sabra Israeli. Dorit is from Israel. Um, and of course, I'm American with my family from Chicago. It's hard. I know quite a few people who have not made Aliyah, who have not moved to Israel because they have family that they don't want to be away from in their home countries. In my case, though, I'll speak to this from a different angle, and that's the angle of someone who just arrived in the US today. I'm coming to you tonight from just outside of Austin, Texas, which is some of you may know, which is where I base myself when I'm on my US tours. I flew out last night after Yom Kippur ended on El Al, landed in JFK this morning. Nice 7 hour layover in JFK, and then flew down to Austin, where I am. Walked in the door really about 45 minutes before this broadcast began. In just being here in the US about 12 hours, you know, addressing the question of this woman, on the one hand, it's great to be here. It's great to walk through the airport and see NFL football games on television instead of war coverage. It's great to be away from conversation about injured and dead soldiers and hostages and not see hostage posters everywhere. It's a nice breather from that. And it makes you realize, wow, the world is a lot bigger than just what we feel it is in Israel. But at the same time, I do miss it. And I couldn't help but realize how different life is there. I saw a lot of fans today in the various airports. I was there very early, flying out to go see their favorite NFL football team play in a various stadium around the country and wearing their jerseys and carrying their bags with the logos. And I love sports, don't get me wrong, but it all felt kind of ridiculous to me and a bit absurd and even superficial, rooting for the Bears or the Cardinals or Dolphins when in Israel, we are engaged in a struggle that is so much more important and meaningful than any sporting event. And the people we're pulling for are our kids who are serving in Lebanon and in Gaza or on army bases throughout the country. It's a story with so much more gravity and meaning. And believe me, sometimes I wish life in Israel were less meaningful. We could all use the break. But as hard as it is to live there, it's also hard to be away from it. And it's hard to be in a place where that kind of meaning doesn't exist. I don't think most Americans feel that intrinsic connection to America and to protecting America the way Israelis do. And that makes being away from Israel hard. So, to address the question of where to live, I can fully understand the argument for living in the US because it's definitely easier on so many levels, whether it's economic or activities for your kids or just that you always have a parking space and it's clean and it's affordable. But at the same time, you get something very special living in Israel that you will not get anywhere else because you're part of this bigger story. And so obviously, ultimately, this dilemma would have to be answered by your daughter and her, is it future husband or husband if they're already married? But it's not just America in the Middle East when you live in Israel, and it's not just being part of a Jewish community in America if you don't live in Israel. It's really two completely different ways, not just of being Jewish, but of being tied up with a story. And for me, that's why, despite the fact that this past week, Dorit and I had a few conversations about would we ever leave because things are getting rough. For the time being, we don't want to, and my kids don't want to either. I have one who's going into the army next year, and she said, if you leave, I'm going to stay here and be a lone soldier. And Even my younger son, who's 14, is talking about how, he doesn't want to leave. So we're on board, even though it's more difficult. Um, and the meaning is a big part of it. But I think it takes a certain personality to want meaning. Believe me, there are a lot of Israelis who are sick of the meaning and they just want a nicer and easier life. And so they're looking for ways out. That's part of the story too. That concludes tonight's broadcast of Inside Israel. The video of this should be up by tomorrow late afternoon, let's say, 24 hours from now. If you want to see that video or share it, it's at joelchasnoff.com/podcast. That's also where you'll see the links to listen on Apple and on Spotify and to contribute to the fundraiser, which is closing in just over a week. Be sure to join us next week. Again, it's going to be at 9 p.m. Eastern time through December. Really, the intention is to keep it at 9 p.m. Eastern. That's the time we do when I'm in the US. It's easier for me, and I think for a lot of you as well. So hope to see you next week. As always, send me your questions and comments. You can reach me through the website, joelchasnoff.com. If you have a question you want answered or feedback of any type, I'm open to it. I'll leave the chat open for a few more minutes. Thanks so much for joining. Here's to a quiet, safe week for all of us. Laila Tov.